Extremely wicked, shockingly evil, and vile. Woof, that's a movie title. It was directed by Joe Berlinger, who, interestingly enough, helmed the project Conversations with the Killer, the Ted Bundy tapes, which also debuted on Netflix earlier this year. It was a 4-part documentary series about Ted Bundy, and a few months later he ends up coming out with his own narrative feature about Ted Bundy, which also came out on Netflix. I don't know if it's really Netflix having some kind of sick fascination with Ted Bundy or if it's Joe Berlinger himself. Who knows? But for those who are curious to know more about Ted Bundy and kind of like his crimes, who he was, what his personality is like, now you have two different sides to that whole entire story. What this movie specifically does is that it takes Ted Bundy's story and presents it, at least initially, from the perspective of his girlfriend named Liz. The movie starts out with her visiting Ted Bundy in prison just as he's about to be executed on death row. And of course it plays out with them going through the entirety of their relationship to Ted Bundy being arrested for suspicion of his crimes, and then Liz ultimately going through many years denying some of the crimes that he committed, and how that life impacts her and Ted Bundy as well. When you get a movie like this, you know, outrage culture nowadays just looks at something, kind of takes it out of context, and then just immediately reacts to it with sometimes overwhelming results. With this movie in particular, many people saw the casting of Zac Efron as Ted Bundy as a way of like exploiting the narrative, because Ted Bundy was infamous for the fact that he used his charm to basically lure tons of women with his charm and charisma and just natural attractiveness. Casting Zac Efron, some people saw that as a choice that, you know, certainly was in tune with his character, but maybe was just a little going a little bit too far with how literal they're trying to match the charisma of Ted Bundy with an actor nowadays. From my perspective, I think that reaction from Twitter was a little overblown. The way that they utilize Zac Efron in this movie, I think, is appropriate for what they're trying to go for. And if you are going to watch this movie specifically to see how Ted Bundy does in this role, I think you are going to be quite satisfied, because he really is the main draw here. He does what you'd expect, you know, taking his natural charisma that he's personally known for, and he applies it to this persona, but in a way that isn't just used as a cheap way of trying to imitate a person. Anyone who might not be familiar with Ted Bundy in general, which me, I wasn't going into this movie, can look at him, and with the portrayal that he gives, you can understand that he's really trying to not only sell how manipulative he was with pretty much everyone in his life, he also succeeds at helping you understand Ted Bundy in a way that is risky, sure, but it is surprising in that it tries to humanize him a little bit more. That in and of itself is interesting, and the way that Zac Efron was able to bring that to the screen in his performance was pretty compelling. He is the sole reason to watch this, and I think anyone who watches his performance will be impressed for the most part. There's not really much to say about this story otherwise. It has a very strange setup in that it opens with us hearing things from the perspective of his girlfriend Liz. Since the first scene of the movie is played as if we are experiencing things through her eyes, you would think that the whole movie is going to be like that, but strangely it isn't. There are only a handful of scenes where it cuts back to her and it shows her daily life either when she's with Ted Bundy or when he's away in prison. And when they try to develop her character in those type of scenes, the manner in which they do so is just so trite and played out, and it doesn't really have any surprises there. And it's also short-sighted too. You'd think that for a character who was in a way chained down by Ted Bundy and the relationship she had with him, they would actually explore that more with how she tried to live her daily life and with their interactions with others. But since the movie spends so much time with Zac Efron's Ted Bundy otherwise, and the movie is about him even when it's really supposed to be about Liz and her experience with him, it doesn't really add up to enough to really feel as if you know all that much about Liz. And surprisingly not enough about Ted Bundy either. As far as Ted Bundy goes, you learn about events that transpired with him and kind of like the road that he took from, you know, when he first met Liz up until he got sentenced to death. It kind of works in the same way that Bohemian Rhapsody does, where it goes through the events that you expect and you go along the years as you see these people live out their lives. But you don't really understand all that much about the characters. You just know about where they went, not about who they are. It almost seems like as if Joe Berlinger was expecting people to already have seen the documentary series that he made before watching this movie, because there's so little information given about Ted Bundy's actual backstory, you know, his upbringing, what his real motivations are, or what was really going on in his head. There's the assumption that you already know a lot about him going into the movie, And for me, as someone who hasn't watched that documentary series yet, I mean, admittedly, I want to go back and watch it now that I've seen this. But without that knowledge, you know, I watched this movie and I was waiting for that moment to where I could understand more about who he was and how we got to where he ultimately went. By the end, I didn't really feel as if I gained anything. All the things that the movie was trying to tell me just seemed obvious and predictable. And I was hoping to get more, especially from the idea that women were being manipulated and chained down by Ted Bundy, who was basically the ultimate American heartthrob at the time. I was pretty disappointed by that angle of the movie. Otherwise, I mean, it's a pretty inoffensive production. The lighting is good, cinematography, editing for the most part, and direction is also good too. Like, I don't really consider any of the performances here to be particularly bad. Haley Joel Osment in this movie was a nice surprise to see, and he does give a good performance, even though his character, the way that he's utilized, is extremely predictable. This movie as a whole is a very passable experience, and I think for anyone, like I said, who wants to see how Zac Efron does in this role, you know, it's interesting enough from that angle. But otherwise, it's one that I probably will forget pretty soon, and it'll ultimately just convince me to watch the documentary series instead. So ultimately, the score I'm going to be giving it is a C+. As far as an age recommendation goes, for a movie about a serial killer, it's not as intense, dark, or offensive as you might think it would be. There's not even as much language as I expected. I mean, there's certainly a fair amount of adult language in this movie, more towards the second half of it, but it's not pervasive, and there's even really not that much violence at all. There's one scene in the end where you kind of see a little bit of a murder that Ted Bundy committed, including an image that shows a woman having been decapitated. And also there's a sex scene in this movie which is very short, but it's ultimately useless. If you have VidAngel, go ahead and cut that scene out because you won't like the content anyway, but it ultimately serves no purpose in the story. As a whole though, it's nowhere near as offensive as you might think it would be. I'd say it's probably best for people who are at least 16 years old. Thanks again for watching, guys. Look forward to a Retro Movie Minute video, hopefully coming on Friday. It's going to tie into another movie that comes out this weekend, so please look forward to that. Please subscribe to my channel if you like this content. In addition, you can check out my Facebook, Letterboxd, and Instagram pages that are in the links in the description below. And thanks again for watching, guys. Have a good one.